Yeah, welcome everyone to the Becoming a True Human podcast. I'm Dave Kopaz, a psychiatrist and holistic integrative physician, yoga instructor, meditation instructor, author, artist. And this is my colleague here, Chris Smith. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself and give our updates?
Yeah, welcome everyone. We're so happy that you're here. I'm Chris Smith, and part of my background is a marriage and family therapist, doing mostly in-home visits, mindfulness instructor, a grandfather, a grief counselor, and also an author. In fact, just a few weeks ago, I released my book, A Soft Way, which really for me was a way of addressing a gap that I found in my own journey with ulcerative colitis. And I borrowed from the Taoism as a way of addressing this gap in terms of what are ways that one can navigate the unpredictability of a chronic illness. Also, I just wanted to announce a couple things. In June, June 3rd, I will be offering a talk, Why We Need Art. And I'll be offering that at the Osher Center for Lifelong Learning. I'm borrowing from a researcher named Daisy Fancourt, who wrote a fantastic book called Art Cure. Also, we'll be giving a talk at the in Peoria, Illinois, David, where you just were, the Blood Clotting Disorders Institute, and they're offering a talk on mindfulness, whole health, and purpose. So that's just a few things coming up. Dave, I'm going to hit it back to you.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Gavin, for we should have introduced Gavin first before all that. We're still trying to figure out how to do this. So thanks for waiting patiently. So we've got the amazing author and GP, Gavin Francis here, author of many books. Today we're going to be talking about The Unfragile Mind, and I've got a couple other books here, Recovery, The Lost Art of Convalescence, the Sir Thomas Browne book. I like that one. That was a really good one, Gavin. Yeah. So those are the three I've read. I often, Jonathan McFarlane and I talk about the anti-library. So we often have these books that we've got that we mean to read. So I've got True North here, and
Travel books.
yeah, travel book, and Shapeshifters too. I've got that
Oh,
one.
yeah.
Looks
Great.
interesting. Yeah. So those are just a few of your books, but we're going to introduce Gavin by just reading a little bit from the back of his recent book, and then we'll let him introduce himself some more. So Gavin Francis is a multi-award winning author and general practitioner who's worked across 4 continents. As an emergency physician and as a medical officer with the British Antarctic Survey, because I've got True North. Is there a True South?
Yeah, there's an
Or-
Antarctic book too. It's called Empire Antarctica.
Okay, so we'll have to get that one too. He's the author of Sunday Times bestsellers, Adventures in Human Being, Shapeshifters on Medicine, Human Change, and Recovery, The Lost Art of Convalescence, some of those books I showed. He's been shortlisted for such awards as Saltire, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Literary Award for Nonfiction Book of the Year, Costa Book of the Year. I never knew how to say Michael Ondaatje. Do you say Ondaatje or Ondaatje?
Yeah, I think you just say Ondaatje.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. His writing also appears in the Wall Street Journal, NPR, The Guardian, The Times, and the London Review of Books, and he's a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. So we're really pleased to have Gavin here today. Anything you want to say, Gavin, about yourself before we start talking about your book?
I'll just say I'm delighted to be here and chatting about the themes of this book, The Unfragile Mind, which is about my approach to mental health and mental illness as a family physician and as a primary care physician. It draws on sort of 20 years experience of managing the kind of mental health problems that present themselves in the community. It draws on this training in psychiatry and also many conversations with colleagues of mine that are psychiatrists and lots of different case histories of patients that I've known over the years. Something that's maybe worth adding is so a lot of people don't realise that family physicians, about 1/3 of their workload is to do with mental health. And whenever medical services get under strain, it tends to be only the most severe manifestations that make it to specialists, certainly in the UK. And so as a GP, I'm involved in a lot of the mild to moderate end of the spectrum of managing these things and making sense of them and helping my patients make sense of the shifting terrain of psychiatric diagnosis over the years.
Thanks for joining us. And Chris and I both really enjoyed this book, and I sort of teased out a few different elements. One that I'd like to start with is your personal path. You talked about having an unnamed visitation as a teenager, where you went to your GP and you were grateful he didn't diagnose you with a episode kind of or experience you were going through. And then also your professional path, where you were accepted to, was it Cambridge, for like a cognitive neuropsychology master's, and decided to turn that down and follow the GP route. So, there's that personal thread that runs through the book, as well as kind of the theoretical. And I wonder if you could start with, what was it like going back and writing about some of these things that were formative for you?
I found it quite a lovely experience, actually, going back and thinking from a distance of 30 odd years back to experiences that I had as an adolescent. And I was quite an anxious adolescent. I had episodes of plunging low mood, and I was having a lot of difficulty making sense of the world and what it would demand of me as I matured. And I was plagued with kind of fears about things. My anxiety took the form of fear over the future and how it might unfold, and also a sort of draining of the pleasure in life. And I felt as if I was wearing a kind of cold leaden jacket all the time, very weighed down. And I had a very wise family physician then. He was a lovely old GP of the kind of traditional school. He'd known me since I was a toddler, and he listened to me very carefully, and then he recognized ultimately that I was quite lonely, that I hadn't mastered the art of making friends and connecting with people, that I'd been thrown off balance by all the different transitions and transformations that adolescence had brought on me, and he gently talked me through those. And looking back, I'm grateful that he didn't choose to give me a name. He didn't diagnose me with depression, or he didn't diagnose me with social anxiety, or he didn't give me any labels. He talked about my experiences in terms of just that, experiences. And there was a lot of wisdom in that I think benefited me in the longer run. And also, he was quite influential, I think, in my decision to ultimately become a GP, because I had quite a good model of what that role can be. So then ultimately I shifted. I went to medical school, and in the UK you can start medical school at 18. So I went off to medical school at 18 years old, and I fell very quickly in love with anatomy, and then in particular with neuroanatomy. And I had 2 jobs at medical school. I was a barman 2 nights a week, and I was also, in the summers, I would prepare anatomical specimens in the anatomy department, and I really loved the neuroanatomy side. And so after 2 years of medical school, I opted to shift out of the medical school proper and do an extra honours bachelor's degree in neuroscience, just pure neuroscience, with the science students, the undergrads. And I loved that. Really, it took to it extraordinarily seamlessly, it felt like to me. I really enjoyed it. And then I applied to do a master's in cognitive neuropsychology off the back of it, and was accepted. And then I got cold feet, and I thought, do you know what? Actually, I want to finish my medical degree. I'm going to go back from neuroscience, back into medicine, finish my medical degree, and higher specialist training or higher academic training in neuroscience isn't going away. I can always go back to it. But in the end, I so fell in love with clinical medicine that I never went back to pure academic neuroscience. So I stayed as a clinician thereafter. I have no regrets.
That reminded me of a couple things, your story. I was going to be an aeronautical engineer and design spacecraft for NASA, except that I failed my first calculus class and went through a dark night of the soul. And was staring into space and feeling like, I was going to disappoint my family and get booted out of school. And I was looking off into the distance, and I realized I focused in on the books in front of me on the shelf, and I thought, I wonder if I can figure out what I want to do by looking at what I like to read. And so I pulled off a book by Carl Jung, Modern Man in Search of Soul, and a book by Scott Peck, The Road Less Traveled. And I thought, why not be a psychiatrist? So these types of decisions, I mean, for me, I felt that was a really good decision. It brought out a side of me that I think would not have been brought out if I had become an engineer. To working with people, because I was a shy kid too, and so I also thought about a PhD in like philosophy and just reading books. But the clinical work really brings out an aspect of yourself that otherwise might not come into the world. So as you went back and read, go ahead.
Clinical medicine, it's just such a wonderful job, because you get this sort of training in basic science, and then training in clinical science, and training in how to begin to address or face up to the most common miseries inflicted on mankind, and told that your job is to attempt to ease suffering however you can. And then once you train in that for, maybe 6 years or 7 years, you get let loose to just speak to every kind of person. And that's a really wonderful thing about our profession, is that you speak to people of every age, every social class, every color. You chat to them, you explore their lives through your conversations, and you get this marvelous opportunity to try and make some small, often very modest differences to their lives, drawing on both the science but also your experience, which always gets more. And I just feel really extraordinarily fortunate to be in this job, which is essentially about talking to people about how they might ease their suffering and live their lives better. This sort of extraordinary alliance of science and kindness is a really wonderful thing to get engaged with every day.
Gavin, one of the questions that I was thinking about is the title of your book, The Unfragile Mind. And at least over here, I hear healthy mind, resilient mind. And I'm just curious, of all titles that you could pull from, I'm just curious of why you chose that particular one.
Because I think I've noticed over the last 10, 15 years, I've noticed a real change in the culture of how we talk about mental illness and mental health. And I was starting to meet more and more patients that came to me in clinic already with quite a fixed conviction that mental illness, first of all, is a discrete category, that the diagnostic categories that we use have some sort of empirical, verifiable reality based in nature rather than based in culture, and that they're a little bit immutable. So I would have, whereas when I started my career 20 years ago, I would hear people say, I feel low or I feel depressed. I would increasingly encounter people that say, I have depression, or people say, I feel anxious. And then I would start to meet people who say, I have generalized anxiety. And I often sort of push back against that with my patients gently and with great care. But I often push back because I've found that those kind of rigid categories aren't fluid or dynamic enough to describe the reality of almost everybody's lives. And it sort of reifies the term, or it gives them too much dignity, when actually they're much more flexible than that, fluid than that. And they can become self-fulfilling, essentially. So those categories can occasionally become self-fulfilling when we describe them in those very rigid box-like terms. And I wanted to stake a case through this book for a more humble approach to how much we understand about the mind, a more curious approach, but ultimately a more of a kind approach to see flexibility and possibility instead of boxed categories that then cage us in. And so that's what unfragile refers to. I very rarely I see people who are extremely fragile. Actually, what amazes me most in clinic is people's resilience. And I'm always astonished by how versatile, responsive, and adaptable most people are. And so I wanted to foreground that.
I really appreciated that approach. And one of the things that, to me, that helped make that argument is you made many references to culture and different cultures. And I'm just wondering if you would be willing to speak to that with our audience.
Yeah, of course. So when we think about the categories that we use to describe mental illness, and then we think about the history of those categories, one thing that jumps out immediately is that they're always in evolution, and that we only need to go back 20 years, and the kinds of categories we see in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, they're very different now than they were even 20, 25 years ago. And if we go back 50 years, they're different again, and 70 years, they're different again. And that's not to say those categories aren't useful, but it's to demonstrate that the frameworks by which we understand mental experience are always changing. And that's not a bad thing, because I hope that we're always changing them for the better, but also that the mind is inextricably cultural. And so as the culture and the society around us change, the kinds of ways in which the mind can go awry start to change. Because we are inextricably cultural. We breathe language, we breathe society. That's part of our very essence. And so one perspective is the historical one, if I just take the West. But the other perspective is the transcultural one. So if we look around the world right now in the 2020s, different cultures take very different approaches to problems of the mind. There are cultures in South Asia where depression and anxiety are considered very much spiritual problems, not medical problems. And it would be quite culturally imperialist to say that they're wrong. They're not necessarily wrong. They're right for their culture. They're right for the way they work. There's syndromes of anxiety and phobia in China that we don't even have names for, but they're demonstrably real there. Similarly with sub-Saharan Africa, syndromes of anxiety, psychosis that we don't even see in the West. And that is because the mind is so cultural. And so I wanted to foreground that too in the book and show that because the mind is created by the environment in which it develops, that environment has a huge influence over the way that problems of the mind develop. And we're seeing that right now hugely with internet culture and how it's transforming the way in which people both understand their distress, their emotional distress, but also the way they understand sort of distortions in their experience. Yeah, it's a big issue, the effect of the internet. I mean, it's just amazing, isn't it? As a society, we have utterly transformed the way almost everyone accesses information in the space of 20 years. And it's huge implications for how we live and how we understand ourselves and how our problems develop. Yeah.
Got patients now will say, well, I asked ChatGPT about this. What do you think? And one young guy was saying, I tell ChatGPT that you're a great psychiatrist all the time.
It's great, isn't it? But it's terrifying that we're handing over so much responsibility to these robots, because we're starting to see the court cases coming out now, aren't they, of how they might help you plan your suicide, for example, or they might confirm and help you deepen and elaborate your quite distorted or even psychotic beliefs. Because of the way that they're programmed, they're not able to provide that kind of anchor that other support systems would be able to provide. So I'm deeply concerned about the reliance that people have on it, and how unquestioningly people accept what these algorithms spit out, almost like like they're the Delphic Oracle or something. And they say, well, no. So I urge anybody who uses ChatGPT or similar to ask it some questions about things you really know a lot about, and then see how many mistakes you spot. And there's a lot.
Is there anything from your research and history that helps us understand this particular phenomenon? You said the oracle, and that's what triggered that particular thought, but I'm just curious, do we have any references or anchor points that might be helpful in navigating?
Well, I think that, the Oracle is a really good example. My wife and I, that's what we call the internet, the Oracle, because that's how people treat it. And I think that comes from a very deep human need to hand off some responsibility for how we live. And you can see that with the Delphic Oracle back 2,500 years ago. Kings would travel to go to hear the Delphic Oracle pronounce on whether they should go to war or not. They probably already knew whether they should go to war or not, but they would want some ostensibly objective outside force to confirm that or rubber stamp that. And I think that's what we're seeing with people's increasing reliance on AI responses, is that, I don't need to think about that because I asked this neutral, all-seeing, wholly wise resource, and this is what it told me. And so I can just follow that. And there's a great lifting of a burden then, isn't there? I think that's probably where it all comes from. We've all got so many things to decide now. Modern life is so busy. There's so many things vying for your attention, trying to sell you things or make you engage with things or pull you into things. And it's quite nice to just hand off that decision about which one to pay attention to or which rabbit hole to go down, and just hand it off to something which gives the veneer of being objective. But I think we're starting to find out that they're not objective. They've been programmed certain ways, and you have to be quite careful about how you trust them.
Yeah. I also just wanted, again, I'm thinking of those who are listening. Would you be willing to give just sort of like an outline of your book, just so that we can be familiar? You have it structured in a certain way, and I'm just curious why you structured it in that particular way. But it's a great structure. I found it very enjoyable as a reader. So would you be willing to share?
Well, I've been thinking about writing this book for quite a few years, and I have so much material, as I said, as a GP who sees between 25 and 35 patients every day. A third of those consultations touch on mental health. There's a huge amount of discussions that I have around this issue. But also there's a huge amount of learning that I've done over the 30 years that I've been in medicine, 20 years that I've been a GP, and research that I've done. And I was thinking, how can I marshal all this in a way that's really entertaining for the reader, but informative and does the material justice? And in the end, I hit on a structure whereby the first part, which is a third of the length of the book, is called Maps of the Mind. And it is a gentle walk through the different ways that we have attempted as human beings to understand disturbances of the mind, both historically, going back to, say, the ancient Egyptians 2,000 years ago, but also personally on my journey as a physician, how I was taught in the 90s, how that changed in the noughties, how that is changing now. So it goes back over my career, looking at just how much change there's been in the field of mental health and mental illness. That's part one. And the concluding chapter of part one is focused very much on what we now know without a shadow of a doubt, that your mental health in adulthood is massively influenced by your experiences as a child and your experiences with your caregivers, and particularly within the first few years. So this is a sort of a finding that comes up again and again, and across cultures too, that your sense of security that you build in those early years, your sense of what the limits of your personality are, the sense of how you cope with distress and manage distress, your sense of who's to be trusted and who's dangerous, all those things are built early in life. And if there are people who manage to build them later in life, but it can be a real struggle to do so. So that's the focus of part one. And part two, I wanted to write a chapter on each of the 7 main problems that come to me in clinic that people seek help with. So anxiety, and particularly in anxiety problems, mood problems, So either high mood, elation and bipolar disinhibition, and low mood, depression, suicidal feelings. Trauma and the increasing recognition we have across all the therapeutic specialties of how important or how influential traumatic experiences are for our subsequent mental health. Psychosis, and how psychosis hints at something really fundamental to our humanity, which is our incredible ability to reinterpret reality and to make connections between unconnected things. And that's a really powerful and positive, can be a positive thing of our human nature. But when it becomes unmoored, it's so destructive. And we've all heard of people for whom psychosis has been utterly ruinous. And so those are the 5 first sections. Then I've got a section on addiction and self-harm, because as a GP, I see an enormous amount of problems with addiction and self-harm. Addiction, both in terms of substance abuse, but also in terms of behavioral addictions. And we're starting to see that with gambling, or with even internet and various kind of online behavioral addictions. And then the last section is about all the many dimensions of neurodiversity that I now encounter in clinic. So many. And, the full gamut of different neurodiversities that are currently recognized in a clinical context, right from dyslexia and dyscalculia and dyspraxia and executive dysfunction, but also the attention deficit type neurodiversities and autistic spectrum disorder, what gets classified under that. And my own conviction is that there are many, many neurodiversities that we don't even have names for yet. That there's so many different ways of thinking and feeling and being, and it's really helpful for me to think about neurodiversity as dimensional, as ourselves, our ways that we approach and interact with the world, as existing in many, many different dimensions, and how you can have traits in one way but not in another way, and how all of these diagnostic labels we use are huge oversimplifications. We're already seeing even ADHD is starting to shatter into different subdivisions. Autism is shattering into different subdivisions, and because no one label is ever nuanced enough to capture our complexity as human beings. And so it's a kind of celebration of that diversity and the many dimensions, but also an acknowledgement and a discussion of how I approach this in clinic when neurodiversity brings distress. And I'm quite at ease with the idea that we only medicalize things when they bring distress and suffering. And that if somebody is undistressed by their neurodiversity and it's not causing problems, then I don't see any need for it to be medicalized or for me to get involved.
Dave, give me one more question and I'll hand it off. I've got so many. I've got a whole page over here. But one of the, I'm going to say brilliant parts of the book for me, and I'm guessing people who read it, is how you would take one particular area, say depression or anxiety. You'd give a little bit of the history of how it came to be. You'd also go into the actual root, the etymology, and then you'd also bring in the personal aspect of it. And then also your own thinking. And I'm just curious, would you be willing to maybe pick one of those? And just as a deep dive, just so that our listeners can have some sense of the wonderful structure that you gave to each of these different types. And for me, it just opened up really a larger perspective. And I think what I really appreciated is kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, with the impact of technology and AI. What I so much liked about and found very helpful about what you wrote was that you really took us to the origins. And to me, that was so helpful, getting, sort of the groundwork of each of these different areas. So if you'd be willing to do one of those, I think we'd all be much served well.
Sure. Well, you tell me which one you want me to talk about of the 7 chapters, and I can talk to you about it.
Dave, do you have one I want to?
Let's start with depression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
With moods. Yeah.
with mood, so I am the depression chapter is it follows the chapter which is about elation, mania, disinhibition, and I talked about how the elation and disinhibition that you get in mania can be a real positive, and we need people who are rule breakers and utopian dreamers in society, and you can see how that trait has really persisted through history, but also how rapidly it can unmoor and destroy a life and relationships and families and connections. And then I moved on then to talk about low mood and how when we think about any of the mental illnesses or emotional and mental sufferings, we can see that at their core they have a tendency that in a different context or in a different dose they might contribute to human flourishing rather than detract from it. And with depression that's quite hard to see at first, but at its core I'm quite convinced that depression is related to a conviction that life should feel better than it does. That it's aspirational in that sense, that when you're depressed, part of the suffering comes from the fact that you feel the waste of time, that you're not living the way you want to be living. And so the depression chapter is a line, the title of it is a quote from Chaucer, from the Canterbury Tales. And he talks of tears blue and with a wounded heart, which I think is just lovely, that he describes that mood plunge as both blue, so it has a color, and tearful, but it also, you feel this wound deep within you. And what I was interested in, particularly with the depression chapter, was how to explore tactfully and gently with people who feel their mood is so low that they feel suicidal, that impulse. How can we as clinicians be unafraid to bring it up into a conversation? Because there's good evidence that shows that it doesn't increase suicide rates if clinicians bring up the subject, and that it can help, that offers an outlet or a way to explore feelings that people often find too difficult to open up. But also, far more of my work touches on the devastation that a suicide can bring to the families of people who have lost a loved one to suicide. And so I feel a huge amount of my work is dealing with people come to terms with the suicide of somebody that they love. In the chapter I go quite deep into the science of the ideas behind the efficacy of the antidepressants, for example, SSRIs and the other antidepressants, and also look at the kind of really surprisingly new evidence emerging that the way that we thought that antidepressants work is probably not the way that they work at all. So since the 90s, we've been told that antidepressants work by changing the serotonin levels in your synapses, and there's increasing evidence now to show that isn't actually the case. They do work, they do help people. I prescribe them a lot, but they don't work the way that we thought they did. And also, there's actually quite extraordinary levels of enhanced placebo effect involved in antidepressants. And so I do use them, but I'm conscious of the studies, for example, that show that the way you interact with your physician when they are prescribing an antidepressant has a huge impact on whether that antidepressant will work for you or not. And to eliminate the positive benefit, one study found it was enough to use a cold or dismissive attitude as you handed over the medication. So the benefit of the medication was intimately connected to the manner of the relationship and of the encounter, and it being a therapeutic positive encounter, which I thought is really fascinating. I'm also really interested in the overlaps between anxiety and depression and why they often come together, in terms of the ways that both seem to feed on rumination. So people that tend to overthink or to ruminate on things, they can lead either to anxiety or to depression or to both. And I'm really interested in some of the studies that show that a lot of, obviously not at the specialist end with people who are very severely affected, but the mild to moderate end, a huge number of depressive illnesses will self-resolve over a couple of years. And that seems really, really positive to me. There's also new ideas coming out which about our the effect of our diet. Metabolic psychiatry is a really interesting, rapidly changing field just now. Diet, but also microbiome, and your gut feelings are real, and the gut interaction with your brain is also real. But ultimately, I come down on this exploration of the idea that there's only quite a small part of it is biological, but there's a huge amount that's psychological about our coping strategies and our character traits. And there's a huge amount is social in terms of our relationships that sustain us, our relationships of care, whether we're living in precarious circumstances, whether we've got secure and safe housing or not. All these things have huge impacts on whether our mood becomes depressed. That's a very quick oversight of some of the elements of that chapter. Thank you for asking me that.
Yeah, thank you.
Any follow-up there, Chris?
I just thank you. That was really wonderful, and I think it really gives a exploration. I like also, I love your holistic view, of anxiety and depression, and again, another thing that I really appreciated in this book is just very much of a holistic. And I almost felt like the other thing is that here's somebody that has been in the trenches for a while and is coming out and saying, you know what, I got a few things I want to share with you all. And would you, I'm curious, here's some of my curiosities, and I just would like to share them with the larger public.
Oh, thanks for that. And I wanted to, emphasize an approach of humility and curiosity throughout this book, because I think we don't fully understand the connection between body, brain, mind. We don't fully understand the origins of many of the emotional and mental distressing states of mind that we get into. But that's okay. We still have a lot of experience in terms of what helps most. We still have a lot of medications that can often help. We know a lot of social interventions that can help. We have a lot that we can do to help. But it's worth remembering just how little we know at the same time and staying a bit humble.
Yeah, the other thing I have to tell you that happened for me in reading your book is this was, I think, in the first section when you were talking about the brain and the mind. And I had this image that I never thought of in terms of how the mind may work. And you've seen at times in the sky starlings that fly together. And, the murmurations, I think, is and I thought, oh, maybe that's a good metaphor of the mind. One thing can happen and all of a sudden the mind is sort of communicating in all these different ways. So thank you for that.
Oh, yeah, thanks. And one of the images that I return to through the book is of water flowing. And I feel like we got into this metaphor of brain function as being like electronic network, and it's so pervasive in our culture. People talk about, oh, I'm wired differently, or I'm wired that way, or I need to rewire. And but the brain isn't wired. We know, or it's wired if you could get a circuit board made of jelly that could regrow and adapt and change. So I often think that this wiring metaphor is sometimes taken too far, and it's a roiling dynamic sea of energy, which is constantly influencing every other bit of itself. In a way, it's more like a whirlpool or a flowing stream than it is like a circuit board. And so many of, you could imagine, for example, that our early experiences and our genetics influence the riverbed, but there are all sorts of ways in which we can clear or clog the flow of it, which we can increase and decrease the flow of water through it. There's lots of things you can do to adjust and modify the flow of our thoughts through our brains. And we're not just stuck with some sort of fixed system that's unadaptable.
So you're going back to the Egyptians is what I'm hearing right now.
Yeah. So I should explain for your listeners that I touched only slightly tongue-in-cheek on the idea that the Egyptians believed that the body was a river system that had to be kept flowing. And they were obsessed with enemas. And the most privileged position at the Egyptian court was keeper of the royal rectum. So that's the origin of that. But I think we flow in different ways too.
I think the way we use metaphors can help shape things, and that's like Louis Malmadrona talks about narrative psychiatry, and how if we only dance and sing neurotransmitters, we'll have a kind of sad life. But if we can dance and sing other ways of being and understanding ourselves, we can change our stories and change our lives. And I think that's a lot of what you do in your book. You write very, very well as far as like taking difficult concepts, condensing down the history, and the book flows. The book really flows, so it's easy to read, I found. There was a quote that you had. I wanted to kind of go back to this on page 34, the way you stated, every mental health problem I see in clinic has at its core a tendency that in a more measured dose or different context could contribute to human well-being rather than detract from it. And that seems like a really important concept. And, how do we build a metaphor around that to talk with people? Because, like people come in and tell me my anxiety makes me do this, or I can't do that because of my anxiety. And I think, well, who's your anxiety, or who's this thing you're calling your anxiety? And instead of strengthening that, how can we shift to a metaphor of unfragility? Or, what are your thoughts with that, the way you talk with patients?
Yeah, I often begin with anxiety. I often begin with the common observation among counselors and therapists, that a little anxiety is good for you, that we all need, the world is dangerous. There are dangerous people out there. There's dangerous situations. A little anxiety helps keep us safe. There's a lovely line from Donald Winnicott, who's a repeated touchstone in this book, and many of your listeners will know, the child psychiatrist, pediatrician. For me, a very kind of wise figure of the 1950s and 60s who wrote some wonderful books. And he's got a line where he says, a child who is never afraid is ill, because fear is really important to develop an appropriate sense of fear. But a child who's always afraid is also ill. And how we learn the limits of our safety and in what circumstances we're safe are really important. Another metaphor I use in the book discussing anxiety is about burglar alarms or fire alarms, and how we need a fire alarm. Like, fire alarms are really useful, but fire alarms that go off when it's windy, that's just unhelpful. So we need to find a way to calibrate our inner fire alarm so it goes off only in the appropriate situations. And then explore how I sometimes approach that in clinic, with cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, but also sometimes with medication, and sometimes even just if somebody isn't asthmatic, with something as simple as a beta blocker, just to wind down and dampen down the effects of that adrenaline storm. That can be really helpful. Sometimes a prescription of antidepressants, a modest dose, helps people gain a little bit of distance from the intensity of their emotional experiences, which they can find really beneficial, like a breath of fresh air at times. But often I focus on trying to map with somebody what the triggers are for their fear and anxiety, but also how they built a sense of safety and danger when they're in their younger years. And often, if people find or in excavating their own memories or their own experiences or their own reflections, they can often realize that their anxiety has its roots in that faulty calibration of what's worth getting afraid about or what's worth getting worked up about. And even that reflection can be profoundly helpful. I don't know, I'm curious to ask you two about this fascinating shift that we've got going on in our society right now, where we're seeing a a very gentle but definite shift away from the characterization of certain kinds of states of mind in terms of personality disorders towards the increasing reclassification and claiming by patients with lived experience that prefer to understand those experiences in terms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's this shift, which I have generally found as a really positive one among my patients, away from thinking that doesn't describe me, the idea that my personality is disordered. The way I feel, it makes much more sense to me that it's a consequence of things that happen to me. And that can be really, really positive. And similarly, the reason I brought that up now is because even just with something as common as anxiety, that excavation and reflection on early childhood experiences of safety and danger can be enough to tip people into realizing that their anxiety has its origins back then. Not always, but sometimes.
I think that's a good question. And in a way, we may be going back in circles. I've thought a lot of times the way that psychology advances is it takes a step forward, and then someone says that was wrong. No, we're going to take a step in a different direction. And then somebody takes a step back and says that was partly right, so let's kind of go that way. And then they take a step back again. So, from a psychodynamic perspective and psychoanalytic perspective, a lot of what we call personality disorders now, we're seen as some type of trauma or deficit in child rearing. You mentioned Freud's view, the early view of the seduction hypothesis, and how he was viewing hysteria as something coming from sexual abuse. My own personal training was in trauma. One of the reasons I was interested in trauma and PTSD is at the time there was no medication for it. And so I thought, okay, I can just talk to people and find out about things. I can talk about existential issues, life and death issues, and I don't have an easy medication for PTSD. Now we do have some, that we use. But, even I remember back from my training reading in trauma literature that 85% of people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder had significant trauma in their childhoods. And so I've always thought of personality disorders as kind of post-traumatic personality conditions.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? And in the trauma chapter in this book, I tried to dip into the big question of why two individuals that have exactly the same traumatic experiences in childhood, one will develop really quite disabling PTSD type symptoms and ones won't. And I like that idea drawn from clinical psychology, that they're just, some of us are a bit more like dandelions and we can take a huge amount of poor treatment, and some people are more like orchids and they have a sensitivity there, which is sometimes a really helpful way for patients to think about it. Sometimes I have people say, my sister and I, we had the same childhood and she's fine. Like, why can't I get past this? And I say, but you're different people. You're different people and you've different constitutions and subtly different experiences. So there's a lot going into why you shouldn't have exactly the same responses to the childhood you both experienced.
In my experience, again, working in a very small county where I would go to people's homes, I mean, for me, the orchid and dandelion, so one has to pick one or the other, and I kind of preferred a continuum. The continuum always gave hope that if you were a dandelion, great, and if you were orchid, there was always this hope that, you could be somewhere on the spectrum. And so then part of the investigation was, what are those things that might help you find the balance that you're looking for? And what might be some of those things? And to try to look around with, again, in a rural area, not a lot of resources, what might be some of those resources? And often, like what you say in your book, Gavin, a lot of times the clients would teach me, and then in turn, then I could share whatever that resource, with others. And that to me was I always felt like I was a messenger of sorts in terms of what I learned from patients and clients.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And there's a real privilege to being trusted with people's stories. But over the years of doing this kind of work, I do think that you build this enormous memory bank of experiences of how things turned out, both for good and for bad, that then you can reflect back to other patients in other kinds of trying circumstances. And sometimes people respond more to that than to something that you've lifted from a textbook. You know, they'll respond to, well, I remember this family 10 years ago, and, you know, you can anonymize it and say, but this is what happened. And people find those kind of stories much more helpful and ultimately redemptive and hopeful than other kinds of stories.
I'm just curious, how did you decipher this question of, you know, when medication supports healing and when medication mutes, maybe prevents someone from really sort of the deeper story?
I find it really difficult to know when to start weaning off medication. And so, of course, I always just do it very much in tandem with my patients. So I'll throw out some exploratory questions. And if they have an appetite themselves to reduce, then we'll start to explore what that might look like and what would be the most appropriate way and the appropriate tempo in which to do that. And I think most people actually have a realization that their medication both helps them and hinders them. So I'll often hear people say that, oh, I couldn't live without my fluoxetine, maybe. But it does mean that there's less joy too. So they'll say that their mood is lifted by it. They don't get the relentless dark. But they also, when something really wonderful has happened, they don't quite feel it as well. And that's quite a common experience when chatting to people about, for example, their antidepressants or even about their lithium, for understandable reasons. But I've even been hearing it more recently from people who are on sizable stimulant doses for ADHD, and they'll tell me, oh, it really helps me focus for a while, but it also, there's a part of me that it shuts out. There's a part of me that was a bit more impulsive and a bit more fun and a bit more engaged with possibility, that it closes down and shuts off. And I find that one of the really lovely parts about the job is the fact that there is no one size fits all. You know, you have to explore with each patient what the advantages they get from their medicine might be, what would be the risks of reducing. Is it right for them? Are they risks they're prepared to take at the moment? And so that is a very gentle discussion. And one of the nice things about general practice is, although my time appointments are short, I do have the opportunity to see people repeatedly again and again and again. So it's quite easy to say, do you know what, this month, let's do nothing, but let's meet again in a month's time and see how you feel. And then we can think about it. So there's a sort of relationship that builds up across time, even though the encounters themselves are short.
There's a great story by Oliver Sacks in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat about a drummer, jazz drummer, who had Tourette's disorder. And the medication he took, it would suppress the tics, but then he found he wasn't able to do the jazz drumming as much because he would incorporate the kind of, you know, different tics and spontaneous movements into the jazz music. So he realized he would taper off before a show. And I'll tell that to patients sometimes too, to think, you know, is there something that about your symptoms that's positive, that we also want to have that part of you that's unmedicated come out somehow, and to not have it just be like the person who says, I want you to get rid of my anxiety, because we're never going to be able to do that. But how can we find that right dose? And I tell people too, it'll change over time, like with SSRIs, that if they start feeling like they're emotionally blunted for the positive, that's sometimes a sign that maybe they don't need as high of a dose. And so we can cut down. Yeah.
It's really, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I want to follow up. We're getting near the end here. I want to follow up on something in your book about the doctor as medicine. If you could talk about that a little bit. You were kind of touching on it earlier, I think, about sharing your experience and sharing other stories. And what about sharing your own story as medicine?
Yeah, I think it can be incredibly powerful with the right relationship, the right patient relationship. Well, if you judge or you intuit a patient is going to be open to that. And I've written elsewhere, for example, there's a short chapter in my book about convalescence and recovery that I really strongly have had the sense over my 30 years in this walk of life that the very best doctors have got very good skills of quick intuition of what kind of doctor they need to be in this encounter to get the most benefit for the patient. So some people really respond well to quite a authoritarian, even paternalistic type doctor, and particularly more elderly patients. And if you try to be too fraternal with them rather than paternal, they don't like it. And vice versa, if you try to be too paternalistic with some people, they can really react against it. And so I would be careful before sharing my own story or my own vulnerabilities with patients, but that doesn't mean that I haven't done it in the right relationship. If I think that the patient would benefit from that and they won't, it won't undermine what's happening in the therapeutic space. Yeah.
I'd like to follow up with just a little question. I'm sure this will be easy to answer. So there's what we can do in the session with people. We can have that alliance of science and kindness that you spoke about. And I think that comes through in the book, that you bring both of those together in your person. How can we change the society and culture to have more kindness and caring in it? So if you can answer that little question.
Yeah, just a little one. I mean, I think in lots of ways it's already happening. So I do see that despite what's happening in the world politically, some of the aspects of internet, mass media, internet culture have led to a more understanding and kinder approach to some aspects of how we interact. So one example for that might be how over time I've noticed it's easier now for people to come and approach me to describe themselves as emotionally vulnerable. So we've destigmatized mental illness hugely, and people find it much easier now to come to a doctor to say that they're struggling. And that is a sign that we are bending towards kindness as a society in some ways. Similarly, in the UK context anyway, in terms of how the process of certification for accessing benefits and so on, there is I have sensed there's an increasing awareness that if you can't cope or can't manage with your work and the demands and the obligations and responsibilities of your work, there's more of an awareness that sometimes mental health conditions can be as disabling as physical health conditions. So that has been a positive. There's also been, of course, a terrible coarsening of other aspects of culture. And the most deeply troubling one is the polarization of entrenched opinions that is really fed by social media rather than by internet. So I'm really deeply troubled by the fact that so much of our public social discourse is driven by social media algorithms which reward polarization. And if the algorithms were much more neutral, then we wouldn't have that. So that's quite good in a way, in that it's got a solution. Like, if it was possible to legislate that social media algorithms shouldn't be optimized to solely deepen and heighten extreme opinions the way they are at the moment, and we're obliged to be much more neutral in how they gave you information, I think that would be a big step forwards. And the other thing that's quite good about online culture is that you can just switch it off. Like, sometimes I have to remind people, you can just switch it off. You can delete the app. You can unplug. And some people get so tied in that becomes almost unthinkable. And they're quite shocked at the proposal that you just delete the app, stop using it. But it's always possible.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good, hopeful thing, that we could use our powers for good instead of evil because of the way the algorithms are programmed. So
Yeah, and I don't know how we do that. It would require some sort of legislation and a different funding model, maybe. But it's quite worrying that and we're starting to see some court cases, aren't we, about social media companies being brought to trial because evidence has emerged of algorithms that quite explicitly set out to deepen behavioral addictions in a damaging way, kind of in the same way that tobacco and alcohol and so on are addictive in a harmful way. We're starting to realize that certain behavioral addictions can be deepened and weaponized through the algorithms that govern them. So that's a positive step too. We feels like we're emerging from a Wild West period of social media. And in 20 years, they'll look back and they think, wow, those guys didn't regulate anything at all. Like, 10-year-olds with Snapchat, like, it's extraordinary. But we will look back, I hope, with a bit more wisdom that on this period as a kind of extreme end of the pendulum. And I really hope that we start to swing back again.
Gavin, one of the things that actually Dave brought this up several months ago, we have this podcast that's called Becoming a True Human. And so one of the things we've begun to do with our guest is to ask them what that means, because we don't know what it means exactly. It's kind of the joke. But to you, what is becoming a true human?
Okay. For me, I would argue that all the great world philosophies pretty much agree that the three big priorities for human life should be about developing your kindness and your compassion to your fellow man, and being humble about the limits of what you really know and understand, and developing and fostering a kind of reverence, both for the fact that we're even here on Earth and for Earth itself and for other people. And so those three, humility, compassion, reverence, I think becoming a true human is somebody who is able to prioritize those three and focus on them and bring that ambition to fruition in their life. I think that would be my focus. But also, you can get a bit too serious on this as well. I think it's also really important to cultivate some levity and a little bit, a big dose of curiosity, and a bit of levity, a bit of curiosity, and also equanimity, calm, even-tempered in the face of adversities or in the face of bad news, good news. So those are like the added extras.
Thank you. And I hope you write that into a book, please.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an incredible answer. On the topic of levity, I made a joke
Good.
from your book that DSM-6 is going to have a new diagnostic category called compulsive diagnosing disorder. And it's mainly going to be mental health professionals who have this compulsive diagnosing disorder. So
yeah. I think let's write to the American Psychiatric Association now. Insist.
Right. Yeah. I wonder if to end you could read that quote from Burton that you end the book with, and you've got it in two places there.
Yeah, of course. So this is Robert Burton, who in 1620s he was a clergyman in England, and he wrote a huge tome, 900 pages in the modern edition, called The Anatomy of Melancholy, and so I'll just quote Burton right at the end of this book, essentially the conclusion of the book, finishing with Burton, is: the ways we understand the mind are always changing, but the elements of what makes for a happy life remain the same. Love and work, community and connection, effort and ease, change and flow. And this is Burton. Be not solitary, be not idle. Happy ones, be cautious. Unhappy ones, have hope. It's kind of amazing that he finished his 900-page magnum opus with those words in 1628, I think. Mm.
That is. I've tried to get through that book several times. I should probably start from the back and work forward.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much. It's been really a pleasure to talk with you, and we appreciate you taking the time today with everything going on.
Yeah.
And you know,
Well, thanks, Dave. Thanks,
so
Chris.
much. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gavin. This was
Such a pleasure.
wonderful. Thank you for the work that you do.
Okay, I'll go ahead and stop recording here.